Hello, everybody. My name is Erin Griffith. I am the interim educator over here at the Silver City Museum. For those of us that have never been to one of our programs before, usually we hold them at the beautiful historic Silco Theater in downtown Silver City, and it looks like this. So this is sort of, you can have a little bit of the experience, pretend you have some popcorn or some soda with you. So I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out today. Hopefully everybody has figured out how to get on. We have such a great crowd. This is so exciting. This is our first time doing this virtually, and I am very happy about it and very excited. Hopefully everybody can see each other. If you have any questions, there's a Zoom little chat box. It says Zoom group chat. I'll be talking on there, and I encourage all of you to ask any questions that you might have on the technical side. Any questions about the actual content, please save till the end of the talk, and we'll have a Q&A session. I wanted to let you know beforehand that we usually, all of our programs are always free to the public. We do, however, request a $5 donation. Since this is an unusual, uncharted territory, I will be providing a link to the donation page where you can donate to the Silver City Museum, either through credit card or PayPal or something like that, if you so wish. We desperately need your support. Having our physical wall shut down has made us try to be very innovative, but it's certainly not easy on everybody. So if you can, we really appreciate your help. Also, everyone tuning in to see Dr. Sparks here, and she's going to be talking about tuberculosis, which, you know, is not exactly what we're going through today, but there are definitely some similarities, and it's another time in history where Silver City, Grant County, and the whole world went through a pandemic, and so many people came to the Southwest, to this area, to recover from health issues and be in the sunshine and the fresh air. Was recommended by a lot of physicians at the time. So Dr. Sparks also wrote this amazing book called Ping Pong Balls and Donkey's Milk. It's a history of tuberculosis in Southwest New Mexico. And if the title doesn't get you, I don't know what will. But so I really do encourage you all to check that out. So what we have today is sort of a Cliff Notes version, and she'll be showing us all of the highlights. But the book itself is available at the Silver City Museum store, which will be up on an online basis. We'll be putting the online shop up here shortly. In the meantime, please go ahead and you can email the store at silvercitymuseum.org. I'll be putting that up on the chat box as well, and you'll be able to email and request a copy from her. So any other questions, anything? Please forgive any technical difficulties we may go through. We have tried to rehearse and get everything settled, but who knows? This is our first shot, and I really appreciate all of your patience. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Sparks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin. I'm assuming everybody can see me because I can see me, so that's a good sign. The great honor for me is to talk about mostly people who I knew because I was a medical technologist out at Fort Baird, as many of the people who had been patients there were employees at the time, and I just started asking questions about their experience, and I was able, from oral histories, to write the little book that talks about what their experience was like. I also tested positive for TB as a medical student, so it was a near and dear to my heart. I had to take medications for a year because of my positive skin test. But did I really have it? I don't know. I never had any symptoms or any x-ray changes. But that's one of the reasons I'm very interested, and I'm very, very complimented to every person who took the time out to listen for, shouldn't be more than an hour for me to talk about one of my favorite subjects. My approach is going to be threefold. First, I'm going to describe our area in Southwest New Mexico as I think it was around 1900. And that'll sort of set the stage for when the lungers and the wheezers, as they were called, came and really enhanced our economy here. They also enhanced our TB burden, of course. Then we'll talk about what is TB to give a picture of what the challenges were. And the third part is to go through the evolution of treatment for tuberculosis in the Grant County area or Southwest New Mexico. So Erin's going to be running pictures for me, and would you bring up the first one because it's about the most relevant. Let's see if we got the technology to go that route. In 1866, the fort out at what's now Fort Baird was established, just a bunch of tents, and it was to take care of what was called the Apache problem. And the Apaches didn't like us as Europeans coming into their land, and we were beginning to do mining and we were doing ranching. And the Apaches took many opportunities to try to disrupt both of those. So this interesting shot here are the Navajo volunteers. Well, I don't know if they were volunteers. They probably had all been moved to Fort Stanton and were recruited by the military. And they were hired to come to Grant County and help us take care of the Apache problem. And here they are at Fort Baird all ready to take on some of their, who were traditionally enemies to help the whites out. You can take that picture down, Erin. What they did was to go out and try to shoot Apaches, and they also were hired to try to kill off all of the deer in the area and all the elk that they could. And the strategy was to try to starve out the Apache natives who were here. I don't know how successful they were at that. There was a book written by a lieutenant, it's also over at the museum, called Recollections of a Western Ranchman, and he was part of that project. And there's a paragraph that is a hoot to read. They skinned all of the deer that they had, and they packed all the meat onto mules, and they were going to go distribute it to the ranchers in the area. But overnight in the corral, one of the mules stuck its nose in a hole, and there was a skunk in there. And it sprayed right up the mule's nose, and it kicked and brayed and threw off all the meat and disrupted all the others, and they all got out of the corral and ran off everywhere, flinging deer meat everywhere. So the Old West was a hard place to live for the Apaches, for the Navajos, for the soldiers. Anyway, let's see what our next picture is. Still there, Erin? The Apache problem was pretty much solved by the mid-1890s, and the soldiers were all contemplating either going home or being transferred somewhere else, and there cropped up the Spanish-American War, in which we tried to supposedly liberate Cuba and take over Guam and the Philippines and Puerto Rico. We succeeded in getting those other three to be our territories, but we had to let Cuba go free. Anyway, in fighting the Spanish in those three venues, we had an enormous number of soldiers coming home with tuberculosis. And New Mexico at the time was touted as a very good place to stay, as was Switzerland. And the Army said, well, we were going to close Fort Baird in about 1900. Why don't we just expand the hospital facilities and begin sending Army veterans here who test positive for TB? That's how we came to be a TB hospital. Interestingly, the groups were separated. We were an Army TB unit, and the unit in Fort Stanton was for the Navy and the Coast Guard and lighthouse keepers. I guess there were many, many lighthouse keepers. They had TB and they were part of the military. So that's who stayed at Fort Stanton. Later, as Fort Stanton population became less and less, the last remnants were shipped over here to Fort Baird until we closed in 1966. Okay, got another picture, Erin? We had some notables here in Fort Baird. There's the original hospital built between 1902 and 1908. And the next slide, probably the most memorable person here was George Patton. Came as a soldier, and he was, go back one, and he was under the, it's the springy slides. He was under the command of General, who was eventually General Blackjack Pershing. And okay, get rid of all the slides for now. So what we were seeing at the time was enormous influx of soldiers with tuberculosis at the same time as there was an enormous influx of people just getting on a train or taking their horse and wagon and their family and coming to the area, because the only thing we had to offer for TB was dry air, high altitude, and good nutrition. New Mexico was really very insightful. About 1901, we had a law that all the teachers in the schools had to be tested for TB. There was a skin test at the time. And eventually that went on up to the children at age 6 and at 14, everybody was tested. I know I was as a kid. I assume that testing is still going on first grade and the beginning of high school. And that contacted a huge number of families that were suffering from TB and either didn't know it or weren't seeking any treatment. Let's see, I need to see what slides there are. Why don't I get over here so I can make a little bit more sense. Sorry, technical difficulties. Can't get rid of that. Sorry, Erin, I can't see what slides you got. So why don't you just put up the next one? This is what Fort Baird looked like as the years went by. People are in their rooms, which had wide open windows, and then oftentimes they were moved out onto the verandas at night so that they could have fresh air. And one fellow told me, one of the people who later lived at Fort Baird, that it was pretty miserable out there in the snow and the rain because they would cover themselves up with oiled down heavy canvas to stay warm enough, but they still had to keep their mouths and noses out into the fresh air. Go ahead, next slide. And next. These were the 4 treatments that were available before 1949. And beginning in the 1920s, when they decided they might be able to operate without killing anyone, they would do a resection of the lung that was most involved. Sorry, don't know what's going on there. I assume people could still see me. To cut out a lung was quite the horrible surgery, of course, and many of the patients died from the surgery, but it did take the burden of TB out of the chest, and if the other lung was just minimally infected, you might get by. The second very interesting treatment, somebody in the 1880s said, well, what if we could rest the lung? And it didn't get any oxygen. So they began trying plomage, which means you put something inside the chest and smash that lung down where it can't fill. And it was quite successful, provided you only had one lung involved. And the original things that were used, let's see, the first thing used was oil. That was a bad idea because the lung surface absorbed it. Eventually we tried glass balls, and finally the inventions of plastic was getting so good or getting so refined that we were able to just cut a little slat between the ribs and stick in ping pong balls. They had been sterilized. And Erin, if you'd skip through some slides until we can see an x-ray of that. Very interesting. There you have it. The ping pong balls were a little larger than that. But the thing that made it possible is that the lung is like a balloon blown up inside of another balloon, the pleural cavity. So we could slide things into the pleural cavity and press the lung down, and people could not inhale enough to fill up that lung. It was permanent. And my first boss at Fort Baird, Bob Martin, who's now passed away, came there as a soldier with TB on one side, and he told me the most fun stories about people with the various treatments. He said one guy coughed so hard that one of his ping pong balls came back out from between the ribs and under his skin, and nobody ever knew where that ping pong ball would show up. One time they came to breakfast and he had it on his forehead, and he could put it over his Adam's apple, because fat doesn't have many blood cells, blood veins, blood circulation. I'm trying to come up with a good word, but no, I'm old. There isn't a good blood supply to fat, and it doesn't have any nerves, so we can move things around in fat without doing any harm and without hurting. And the ping pong balls, there are still probably a few people alive with those crammed into their chests if they got them before 1950. The second treatment was one that Bob had, and it consisted of cutting out the ribs at the back side of the chest, and that was called thoracoplasty. I think we've got a picture of that too, Erin. We might have, so there's an x-ray. You can see probably all little ping pong balls in there on the left side of the screen. The heavy white center is a spinal column, and far to the right is the heart. So that's what a ping pong ball x-ray looks like. And next, this is looking from the back, and Bob had his ribs removed on the upper back side, and that scapula, that shoulder blade, rotates inward and presses on the lung. It's not quite as effective as ping pong balls, but there's a lot more chance of missing out on an infection because you don't actually enter the chest or put in a foreign body. What do you have next, Erin? And that's actually Bob Martin's x-ray. You can see his shoulder blade. I assume that upper white on the right just rotated in completely. And by the way, he gave me permission to use these, and so I'm not violating his privacy with it at all. He continued to smoke 4 packs a day until his death, so I'm surprised that the lung on the right side of the picture is looking so good. But we are resilient creatures. Okay, what's our next slide? Finally, into the 40s, we began what is known as pneumothorax. And it's very easily done. You can just scrub up a spot, have a syringe full of air, and push it in between the two layers of lining and fill up the pleural cavity with air. It hurts like the dickens, and after about a week, all the air will be absorbed by the surfaces, but it is reversible, and it became the most popular treatment in the 40s. It works much better with people who are hospitalized, because otherwise you have to come in to a facility, have it injected, go home, and put up with the pain of it. But you shouldn't be very infectious when you can't generate much of a cough from that lung. So the 4 things that were done, plumage, thoracoplasty, and pneumothorax. There's a really interesting piece of information to throw here. If you see that the air has gone in on that left side of the picture, and only that lung collapsed. And that's because both of our lungs have their own container, so to speak. Unfortunately for elephants and buffaloes, they have both of their lungs inside a single pleural sac. So if you can pierce between the lungs, between the ribs on one side, when the animal inhales, that's the path of least resistance. So air comes from the outside and collapses both of their lungs. So the pictures of the natives that they're painted with them riding alongside and shooting a single arrow into the side of a buffalo actually would have worked. That would have collapsed the animal immediately. It also makes it quite easy to hunt elephants in Africa. I don't know if they hunt them in India, but those animals, and I suspect cows too, because they're in the family of bison, they have a single pleural sac containing both lungs, and it makes it very simple to collapse their lungs. People can get a pneumothorax and an injury, and the way to get rid of it is to make a little incision, insert a tube with a valve in it, and when the lung is filling, pushes air out, and then if the hole has a valve in front of it, you can't pull air back in from the outside. That's about all I got on that. Next slide, Erin. So what is TB? We've kind of set the picture for how things were in the 1900s and what first things were allowed to be done or seemed to work. A doctor in Germany named Koch came up with an idea. We can get rid of the slide, Erin, since I have such an interesting face. Thank you. A guy named Koch said, wait a minute, we don't know what's causing diseases. Let's have some criterion. And the first one is, you take an animal that's sick with something. They did this with leprosy. They did it with strep. They did it with lots of things. He did it particularly with TB because that was literally the pandemic of the world for 300 years, from 1600 on to the middle 1900s. If you lived to be past 50, it was probably because you didn't catch TB. More than half of the people who died before 50 died of tuberculosis. Lots of famous people, all the Brontes, Chopin, D.H. Lawrence, on into our modern era. The most recent people that I know to have died from TB were Vivian Leigh, who played Scarlett O'Hara, and Eleanor Roosevelt, because they could not be completely cured, and because they died the way that most people of TB die. They don't die just of wasting away or the galloping consumption. The TB bacteria eventually breaks into a large vessel in the lungs. You cough a little blood, it's called a sentinel bleed. And then pretty soon there's a gigantic hemorrhage. It's not really a bad way to go, I don't suppose, because it goes very, very quickly. And I think both of those notable people that all of us are probably familiar with died of lung hemorrhage because of tuberculosis is so damaging. So back to Dr. Koch said, all right, I'm going to take someone with TB and I'm going to give that disease, presumably getting something invisible out of their lesions or their wounds or their lymph nodes, and give it to an animal. In this case, it was a guinea pig, I think, or probably mice, can't remember which, sorry. And then the animal must develop the disease, or you must grow it on a plate if you can. And then you must give it to a healthy subject and have the disease recur. So those were called Koch's postulates. And until that idea came around and he wrote about it, no one really was sure that TB was even caused by a bacterium. And the person who changed everything was named Selman Waxman. He was a soil scientist who became a doctor. And he said, wait a minute, tuberculosis is everywhere in the soil. Why don't we all have it, and why aren't we all dying of it? It's just a little soil bacterium that can survive long, long times in dry situations. So after a great deal of work, he was able to come up with a medium that allowed TB to grow, and it was some work. It has malachite green in it, it has potatoes, it has eggs, it has agar. It takes 6 weeks to grow anything on it. So he spent years and years discovering that TB can grow on a plate. And then he said, well, if it's not overrunning the soil, there must be things in the soil that can inhibit its growth. So he spent the next few years throwing things onto plates that he thought might be the inhibitors of TB. And he finally found out the that there was a streptomycin fungus that perfectly inhibited TB, and it took about 4 or 5 more years. That was 1945. And by 1949, they were able to give those first streptomycin treatments to people and begin knocking out what had been a pandemic of over 300 years duration. People still die of TB. They are more likely to die if the TB gets into the bloodstream and goes everywhere. And that's called miliary TB because of millets or little tiny seeds of grain. And if you take a picture of the lungs, it looks like a shotgun blast, and it may be all through their skin, all through their kidneys, all through their brains. And miliary TB, even with terrific treatment, still kills about 30% of people who get it. And that's more likely in children. So let's go back to the next slide, Erin, and see what's up with spitting on the sidewalk. One of the things that that was done in World War II, when the WPA started doing various projects, is that artists were included. On the right side of the screen, that's the WPA poster that was assigned to someone to draw in order to help prevent tuberculosis. We finally became convinced that it can be spread. Don't kiss me, your kiss of affection, the germ of infection. And we actually had all over the West, including in Silver City, laws against spitting on the sidewalk. If you spit on the sidewalk and TB is sitting there, it's really not much danger. We have to inhale it in order to have the most severe form of the disease. And the reason that spitting on the sidewalks was an incredible vector for TB is that women wore long skirts. And they would drag the skirts through the streets, which are now covered with saliva or sputum full of TB, take it home and swish it around on the floors where babies crawled, and now it's part of the dust in their home. And this law made a lot of people very upset because spitting was not exactly included in any kind of manners control until that point. We were all right to spit on the street or in front of company as long as you could, it was a small enough wad to put your foot over it. You were allowed in until about 1700 to spit at the table as long as you spit under the table and not across it where you might encounter somebody. So people felt like their rights were being inhibited, and the people who didn't believe in TB at the time thought this was idiotic, especially when they got fined somewhere between $5 and $25 for hawking up something on the sidewalk. I think we can see a bit of a parallel in what's been going on the last week here, even though it is 2020. Next slide, Erin. Here's a fellow back in 1889 who was already right on it in Germany and Switzerland. And he invented a little cup for spitting in. And it's fairly ingenious. What a spit cup needed was a way to spit into it, and preferably another way to empty it out. You can see that it's got a cap on the top and a cap on the bottom. And his little Blue Henry even has some books written about it. But the people in Switzerland, when they went for TB treatment, which at the time was high, dry air, lots of calories, lots of rest, they tended to buy things like this and then decorate them. So a really wealthy person might have silver swirls or diamonds encrusted on their Blue Henry. In America, as we became convinced that we had to quit spitting on people, we came up with a little paper packages that were coated with wax and foldable and burnable. I think that's the next slide, Erin. Yes, someone actually sent me some of these, and I found some at Fort Baird when we were cleaning out the closets. Bernatol, these people made a fortune with their portable cuspidors. And it reminded people not to spit on the sidewalks, not to spit in the sinks, not to cough on people, and whatever they wipe their mouth with, etc., that it should go straight into the trash. All right. Next slide. Ways to die from TB. First of all, it's just wasting away. It takes an enormous amount of energy to support the body fighting a disease. At Fort Bayard, we had a lot of calorie makers in the form of cows and pigs. There were herds of them, and we tried to supply everybody with about a half a gallon of milk a day. That was thought to be very nourishing. One lady I interviewed from Arkansas caught her TB when she was building ships in the shipyards in San Diego. She was down in the hull all day long with a lot of other people coughing and hacking. She wound up with TB and went home to Arkansas. She said what they grew best was eggplant, and she was required to eat 4 or 5 eggplants a day. And of course, didn't ever want to see another eggplant in her whole life. If your bone marrow gets infected with it, you stop making red and white cells and platelets, and that's a good way to die. I talked about the tubercle, which incidentally is why it's called tuberculosis. A tubercle is formed when the bacteria hits the lung and the lung starts building a capsule around it. If our immune systems were better at recognizing TB as something to get rid of immediately, then it wouldn't have time to build a tubercle, which just gets bigger, 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 and leaves behind scarred or damaged lungs, or works its way into blood vessels and kills a person through hemorrhage. One of the most current ways of trying to combat TB, which has made a huge comeback, is that we are trying to figure out how to make the T cells of our white blood cells more sensitive to the tubercle or to the tuberculosis bacterium, so that when it first hits the lung, then the body will have an exuberant response to it. We've tried to come up with a vaccine. The closest thing that we have is called BCG, stands for Bacterium calumet guerin, which was an old name for TB, but it's the TB that comes from cattle. Ours is called Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Cattle get Mycobacterium bovis. And so clear back into the 1800s, they would either weaken or kill those bacterium and inject them and hope to have a vaccine. It seems to work a bit in children and helping them avoid miliary TB or TB everywhere, but it doesn't prevent tuberculosis for the most part that we can tell. The unfortunate part of that is people come from all over the world, Europe and Mexico and South America, where they're still using BCG vaccines in children. They come to America and get their TB tested on their skin, and it comes up positive because they've been exposed to that particular type of tuberculosis, and now it shows a positive because of their previous vaccination. I hope that made sense, but at any rate, we can't really tell if someone from those countries has tuberculosis if they have a positive TB test, because it may be a reaction to their vaccine from years ago. We've never used it in America as a vaccine. Okay, next slide. I think I already talked about these many people who died of TB. Actually, way back when, 1800s, people thought it was a disease of the wealthy because they didn't realize that all their neighbors were dying of TB. They only heard news when Anton Chekhov fell over from it. But probably more than 50% of deaths under 50 at the time in the 1800s was from tuberculosis, and it had many, many names: the White Death, the Scourge, the wasting disease. I think the most popular one was the galloping consumption. Now we have a great deal more TB because of HIV, which showed up about in the late 70s, early 80s. If a person has HIV, their immune system is bad at resisting most infections, and it's particularly bad at tuberculosis. So a lot of our AIDS patients around the world actually die of tuberculosis that's been either reactivated because they had a small infection that their body managed in the past, and that does happen quite often, or because they were exposed to someone who was active and they didn't know it at the time. There's actually an exact number. If you have AIDS, you're 19 times more likely to get TB than any other person on the street. Go ahead with the next slide. Next slide. Oh no, Florence Nightingale died of TB. Okay. So, oh, and Doc Holliday. And let's get rid of this slide and we'll talk without him for a little while. I hope I haven't put anybody to sleep yet. The nature of tuberculosis is such that if we can find the index case, the person who in the community has somehow caught it, and test them quickly and test their whole families quickly and isolate that group, then tuberculosis can be controlled. That sounds a whole lot like COVID-19. The unfortunate thing about COVID-19 or coronavirus of this type is we don't know who's got it. Probably 50% of people who are carrying it, we don't know it. And so we can't say, oh, you have symptoms, let's test you and isolate your family. So the absolute bizarre thing that's happened with COVID-19, we're isolating, we're quarantining all the healthy people. I don't think we've probably ever done that before in any disease that I know of, because there are so many asymptomatic or unsymptomatic people out there. And it's made it a particularly huge challenge. I won't be talking any more about COVID-19 except to say it's a respiratory disease that's contagious by people breathing and coughing and speaking around us, which is exactly the way that tuberculosis became the scourge of the 300 years before Henry Waxman's streptomycin came along. Something I wanted to mention about Fort Bear that I forgot, sorry. The people who ran the gardens, the orchards, the pig herds, the cow herds, and Fort Bayard were POWs. They were prisoners of war from Germany. And I love to go out to Fort Bayard. I know exactly where their place was that they stayed. They had their own barracks. And they, I think they probably did help as nurses, aides inside the hospital, but primarily they were outside. They took care of the grounds. They took care of all the herds. They built their own places. They really, a good number of them wanted to stay in America after they were freed because they weren't interested in being part of the war anyway, and they just happened to be captured. And they said, wow, this is a beautiful place. We didn't have to worry much about them escaping because Fort Beard is fairly isolated. If they got away, I suppose they could have survived in the Gila wilderness or forest somewhere. But we have large German connections there. My friend Johnny Sanchez, who passed away recently, was a Fort Beard resident. He was a child when the German soldiers were there. He said when he would leave with his pickup truck at age 15, he would carry barrels of water down to Santa Clara. And the guards would always stop him and check in the barrels of water to see if he was sneaking out any German soldiers. It didn't seem like much of a risk, but he always got a big kick out of being searched to see if he was hiding anybody. Some of the German soldiers would not communicate, would not help, did not want to be any part of what went on at Fort Bear because they were true believers in Hitler's plan. And they did need to be watched, I suppose. They weren't allowed to do anything related to the war effort, but they had to be watched more carefully. And they warned all the other prisoners that when they got back to Germany, they were ratting them out, how they helped American soldiers survive a TB epidemic. There are quite a few books written by people. I don't know about any by people at Fort Bayard, but a really popular one from down in Las Cruces. That'll be in the bibliography that Aaron's going to put on when this becomes available online, I hope. His name was Walter Schmid. What else about the people at Fort Bayard? Oh, Fort Bayard Hospital was built in a gigantic H shape. And the people who were contagious stayed on one side, and the people who were thought to be either non-contagious or nearly well were kept on another wing. And I know Becky Smith's listening today. I saw her face on there a minute ago. And her father was the administrator until 1966. She can do a rebuttal later if I'm missing all this reporting it accurately. But he was the administrator of the hospital until 1966. And when it was closed, one of the things that was her job, or that she volunteered to do, was to work in the library. I don't know, packing the books or preparing the books for something else. But as a child, she was not allowed to work in the second library that was for infectious people, because tuberculosis might still be on the books. The way that people could tell whether you were contagious or not was by the color of your pajamas. And I can't, for the life of me, no, I couldn't find out from anybody who knew what color of pajamas did you wear. Bob Martin remembered that the infectious people wore blue stripes and the non-infectious people wore green stripes, but he wasn't sure about it. And people were not held there by any law. If you wanted to get up and leave in the middle of an active TB case, you could. They were there because it was offered to them as a public service. And there were people there who were not soldiers as well. It was the TB hospital of the Southwest. There were 6, 8, 10 other sanatoria. Probably the most popular name for one around here was the Cottage San, and that meant the Cottage Sanatorium. And those buildings that people would come from elsewhere, or I suppose even in town, rent out a space and try to get well and try not to be in contact with other people. Over on about A Street, B Street, and Market Street is an apartment complex now. It used to be St. Joseph's Sanitarium. It might be St. Joseph's Apartments now. But people could get lodging here. You could live with a family. You could live in a tent out in the middle of nowhere in the boroughs. There were quite a few people who were trying to be independent that way. But people came from all over and lived all over the Southwest and all over Silver City and Grant County in order to try to get well from TB. A good many of the doctors who came here to treat the TB patients came because they had TB themselves. And they would take care of patients, and they would isolate themselves with masks and gowns and stay in their own quarters when they were not in contact with people. A lot of people got well, a lot of people did not. I've always wondered if having that many people that has sort of a tendency toward a lung weakness or a lung disease set up our community to have more asthma, allergy, all kinds of pneumonias. I haven't found that to be true, but I think that if we did a genetic study of the people who came and left their DNA here, we might find that we're a little more prone to lung diseases than most places. So the good news is TB was seemingly uncontrollable from 1650 to 1950. And as of 1950, because one man said, how come TB isn't rampant in the dirt? We now have probably 15 or 20 good treatments as medications for diseases. We have good tests in terms of skin tests. We even have a blood test called quantiferon TB Gold now. If I could draw your blood and have it run within 12 hours, I can tell you if you have TB, rather than you needing a skin test that takes 48 hours to read. And then you have to cough on a plate, and then we have to wait 6 weeks to see if it grows TB. And then we have to wait another 6 weeks to see what it's sensitive to. Unfortunately, in what people call third world countries, or what I think of as less developed countries, we can't use the blood test there out in the rural areas because the blood must be tested within 12 hours. So people are working on making that more accessible. And I think that's a primary bunch of information I was hoping to let you know about today. And Erin, do we go for written questions or verbal questions, or have some guidance for you?
Hi, everybody. So what we're going to do is, Dr. Sparks, are you comfortable muting and unmuting people?
I think I can do that.
Okay.
Do I do it with my finger like that? No. Let's see, I just need to get my picture back here.
So what we will do is, if everyone will write your questions in the box that you see there, you should see a chat box. If not, there is at the bottom of your screen, it says chat and a button, and it has sort of a talking bubble like you see in comic books. So click on that and you'll see a chat box. And in that chat box, if you will type your questions, and then if Dr. Sparks wants to unmute you and answer that, we'll ask you to repeat the question verbally so everyone can hear, and then Dr. Sparks can answer. Or Dr. Sparks, if you have trouble unmuting, I can unmute and you can then answer from there. Right before we start this, I just want to let you know that I'll be posting some links very shortly that has some information about donation, which we would very much appreciate your support. That page that will take you to will allow you to donate to the museum and also give you some information on becoming a member. And also, we would be very grateful for some of your feedback. We'll have a survey that will be coming up as well. You just click on that link and it'll take you to that. It will also, that link will also allow you to put some information if you would like to be on our mailing list. So you will receive information on this lecture when it becomes available recorded. And maybe you'll even see yourselves, huh? And also, just keep looking at the board. And so the first question that we have here is from Marianne Ritter. What would you like to address first?
Let's see. Actually, Marianne, I don't see a question. I see that she says her father was a director of Fort Baird in the early 60s, and that he would have enjoyed this talk. I wish he was here to answer some questions for us. My nephew Kyle up in Seattle says, where does donkey's milk show up? Oh, I forgot to go down that road. Back in the early 1900s, we said, oh, drink milk, drink milk, drink milk. And then we discovered, oops, cows are one of the animals that can transmit TB in their milk. So until we had pasteurization, people considered that cow's milk was unsafe to drink. Actually, you don't get TB from drinking it, I guess because of the stomach acids. And cow TB is not exactly the same as ours, although we can catch it. People were more likely to catch it from the inhaling aerosolized cow TB, which would be in the barnyards. Or if the cow had a wound or a lesion and you had a wound, if you get contaminated in your own bloodstream, you could die from that. So people said, oh, they made a leap. We shouldn't drink cow's milk, we'll get TB. So they began drinking all kinds of other milk. Donkey's milk, mare's milk, goat's milk, which may actually have cut down on the amount of TB which was contracted by people. And the people who drank donkey's milk seemed to get over their tuberculosis even faster than anyone with cow's milk. So there were some papers written by visiting doctors at Fort Baird who came to investigate the donkey's milk idea. And they decided that, in fact, those people did get over their TB quicker, but they drank it because they didn't want to catch TB from the milk. But as it turned out, they had two benefits. They didn't catch TB from the milk, and they also may have healed quicker. And I looked up goat's milk this morning to see if that was also believed of goat's milk. And even as recently as 2016, someone wrote a paper, scientific paper on goat's milk has proteins in it that help fight TB. So in countries where they use goat's milk, less likely for people to contract the illness. So sorry, I'll skip that question, and there's the answer to it. David McNaughton, my buddy from high school, wants to know if that's the old Gila Theater. No, that's the old Silco Theater.
David?
It's about a block down.
David,
Yeah.
Hi, would you repeat your question out loud and then we can talk about that?
I was at the time of your introduction, looking at your background, I thought that might be the old Gila Theater, and I've since been informed that it's not.
No, the Gila Theater is down the street. This is the Silco Theater, which has been refurbished and is in operation, and we do a lot of our programs here. Last, we had Dr. Sparks come join us at the Soto Theater a few months back. We had a great time, and it was a full house. So I just wanted to, you know, kind of keep the mood, remind us where home is. Anything else?
Here are a few more questions. Someone's asking why are AIDS patients dying of TB? Doesn't streptomycin work? Actually, all of the drugs that have potential against a particular tuberculosis strain can work, but the body cannot do its part in AIDS patients. You need both medication and their white cell population to be working together, and they just don't have half of the formula for getting well. Someone said, have you seen Pott's disease? This is very interesting. There are 3 illnesses in the history of medicine, Western medicine I know of, that are called the Great Masqueraders. Long ago, it started off with TB. TB could present as a lump in the middle of your forehead, and that was called Pott's puffy tumor, or a lump on your spine, which was called Pott's disease, or a big lump in your neck, which was called scrofula. And until we had the name of the bacteria, we thought these were all different diseases, and they were just that the TB was able to sequester in whatever part of the body was prone to it. Back in the 80s, I drained somebody's swollen knee fluid, and it turned out to be tuberculosis. The TB can present as anything. Mostly it will be fever, weight loss, cough, those sorts of things, but you might have a draining ear, and it might be tuberculosis. The next disease that was the Great Masquerader was syphilis, and it also can present as almost anything. And finally, now we have AIDS, which may present as anything. I had a little boy with a draining ear. I couldn't get well. I finally tested him for AIDS because he should have been able to combat it. And a 6-year-old with a draining ear had HIV. So, and I'm using HIV and AIDS incorrectly. The medical people on board will be going, you're not talking about that the right way, but HIV is the virus, and you get the infection. AIDS is the disease that it actually causes. But that's why we had Pott's disease. That's why I've never seen it. I did see a knee abscess from TB, but I don't think it has a specific name. Nobody was able to pin their moniker on that one yet. Somebody asked, did breathing cold air actually help? We don't really think it's the cold. We think it's the dry. And there's not as high an oxygen tension here as there is, say, at sea level. So the higher you are and the drier you are, the less aggressive tuberculosis seems to be. So it doesn't cure it, but it seems to help it. And calories were very, very important. You might eat 6,000 or 7,000 calories a day and still lose weight. Those 3 things combined in the perfect setting. And if you didn't have too big of a burden of TB in your lungs, you might get well from it. Probably 10 to 12% of people died from TB if they just get it and depend on the body to try to control it. If you've inhaled one bacteria, you probably never know it, and you probably sequestered it and the body put it dormant or killed it somehow. If you've inhaled, unfortunately the number is pretty low. They've actually counted them. If you've inhaled as many as 10 bacterium, then you are likely to contract the disease. So masks in those days certainly would have helped as well, but we didn't know how to control it very well until 50 years before we actually figured out how to cure it. I hope that answered the question. Cold air didn't help, but most high places are pretty chilly. Let's see. Did Madame Millie's sister have TB? Yes, that's the reason that they came here. For those of you who don't know, Madame Millie was a famous purveyor of prostitutes in our locale. She came on a train from, I think it was Tennessee. There's an entire book written on her. Their parents died in the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, and many kids got put on trains to just go somewhere else. A lot of them got off whenever they got tired or hungry, and Millie knew that her sister had TB, so they came to Deming. And they got off there, and she became a oh gosh, I can't think of the name of it. They had hotels everywhere. Wasn't a Harley girl, a Harvey girl. She made $50 a month, I think, or it was 35, sorry. Madam Millie, who was at the time not a madam, made $35 a month as a Harvey girl. And these were lots of pleasant looking young women who were educated, who were oriented to service. They rode the trains, they worked in the restaurants, they kept people company, they made sure that the service part of the trains and the depots ran. And unfortunately, Madam Millie's sister was in a sanatorium in Deming, and her fee for care was $35 a month. So Millie really had nothing left to live on. And she figured out that selling her own body was one approach to surviving and keeping her sister alive, and ultimately became the madam for many people in the area, the women in Deming and Silver City, and for some reason she branched out to Ketchikan, Alaska. I saw her place up there in the row of prostitute houses up there in Ketchikan a couple of years ago. When she would rotate the girls, and I understand when they had a new girl in town, they had a little dog that they would put on a leash, and the new girl would go walking downtown with the new dog. She's an integral part of TB history here. I also had forgotten completely until I was reviewing what I said about Madame Brewer, who did not have prostitutes and who was just a medium locally and lived to be 102. She also apparently came here because of tuberculosis from Georgia, which I hadn't remembered at all when I did my talk on her. So yes, Madame Millie's sister had TB. I also think she might have died of it because I don't remember hearing any more about her after that information.
Dr. Sparks?
Yes, ma'am.
Someone, Lisa Kurtzy, asked about reading about an African-American woman writer that came here to recover from tuberculosis. I thought that's an interesting question and might tie in. Does that have any relation to the Madame Brewer story?
Not that I know of. Madame Brewer was not a writer, although she certainly was a person of color who came here and contributed greatly to the economy because of her many talents. But I'll look into that, Lisa, because I haven't heard of specifically a writer who came here for that problem.
I'm going to unmute Lisa and see if she has anything to say. Okay. Where is it? There. Let's see. Hi, Lisa.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted now.
Oh, there you are. Hi.
Hi.
Did you want to say anything else about that?
No, I just remember reading that, and I didn't know anything more about her, but I think it's a part of our town history that probably should be more known.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And maybe that's something that we will look into for future programs or research. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And now, let's see, someone else, Marion Ritter. She said that she lived in Fort Bayard in the early 60s. I would like to hear from her later if she has any interesting information on that. Okay. Let's see, are there any questions that we missed? Did breathing cold air actually help? From Ellen Manara.
Yeah, we talked about that. The air needed to be dry and it needed to be thin, but we don't know that the cold actually helped anything at all. In fact, well, maybe TB grows best in really tropical hot areas.
Wonderful.
Humidity too.
Okay. Are there any other questions out there? You can type them now. Oh, okay. Dr. Trinidad here.
Trini Tolar. Oh, I love that lady. Her son was one of my little docklings who followed me around for a while. I think he's in emergency medicine now.
Dr. Solar, I'm going to unmute you so that you can ask your question and speak to Twana in person? Well, in sort of person.
And sort of.
Hello?
Yes. Hi. How accurate is an X-ray, lung X-ray, to detect TB for a person that tested positive for the skin test?
That's a great question, because you're right, coming up from Latin America, if somebody had BCG vaccine, they would be positive. And then people like me who caught it somehow or got exposed to it and have a positive skin test, but that I know of never actually had the disease. How do we tell? The lung X-ray is absolutely fantastic. It's called pathognomonic. That word means if you've got it, then we know exactly what your disease is. There's nothing else that looks like TB on a lung X-ray. It'll either be miliary with those tiny, tiny thousands of little dots, or it'll be a tubercle with a big old cavity and lots of dead material inside and has a scar around it. So if you were from Latin America and you had a positive TB test and you had an X-ray that was normal, chances are they would give you a choice, I don't know, or they might require or highly advise that you take a 1-year course of antibiotic treatment. Because it's possible that you have TB in a small amount somewhere in the body. If you have the giant tubercles in your lungs, you have it and you need to be treated for it. Then they would start by collecting some of the sputum and putting that on a plate. Oh, I forgot something too. I think some people have probably left, but how did they know at Fort Baird if you were contagious or not? After you started feeling better, you would go down to a giant cold room where the lab actually was when I worked there and run a rubber tube down your nose first thing in the morning, vacuum out the stomach contents and stain it. And that was called stomach aspiration. And if you did it 3 mornings in a row with no bacteria, you were considered in remission. And the reason is because TB patients would cough all night and swallow tuberculosis, and then it should show up in their stomach contents. So if you had 3 negative tests, 3 mornings in a row, then you got to move from one color pajamas to another and over to the other side of the hospital. And then they advised staying another 3 months after that to make sure you weren't contagious. I don't think that's how we diagnose it anymore, but it certainly is a good way to follow a course of treatment on it. Did that answer your question, Trini?
Oh, I am muted. Oh, sorry.
Yes, thank you so much. And Adam is in the emergency room in Albuquerque still.
Is he a resident or he's working?
He's a resident,
Oh, good.
and he will be done in June.
Wonderful. Give him big hugs for me.
Thank
oh, you can't. Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming today.
Okay. All right. Let's see. We have Lisa H. Wants to know how many people recovered compared to who did not.
Great question, and I've read quite a bit of different numbers. I think because for years and years we didn't have accurate data. Certainly at Fort Baird we should have had data, and I don't know the numbers there. It seemed to me that if you had untreated tuberculosis in the 1800s, you were about 50% likely to die from that. As we progressed up through the 1900s, the number went down to 12 to 15%. And now, unless you have HIV or some other reason why your immune system cannot help, then the chances of dying of treated tuberculosis is probably in the 2 or 3%. So in Fort Baird proper, I don't know how many people they lost. The numbers might have been very high by comparison because people didn't want to be admitted until they were really, really sick from it. So many people came there near death and went immediately on to the ward that was made for people who were known to be terminal in short order.
Let's see. How were people able to afford this long-term treatment?
Was paid for by the government, amazingly. If you came to Fort Baird and said, I have TB, they put you in. They charged you and your family nothing because they didn't want the disease to spread. The medications themselves were in New Mexico when 1970s, when I had a positive skin test, were supplied by the health department. So in America, for some reason, they have considered public health a good thing as regards to TB, not too much else. Although HIV, New Mexico is very progressive that way. They voted long ago, we'll treat all of our AIDS patients at no cost to them. And the people who voted against it in the New Mexico legislature said, well, everybody's going to move from everywhere else and come here, which didn't, as it turned out, didn't happen. If you catch TB in California, I mean, if you catch AIDS in California, you're probably going to stay there and be with your family and be with your support system and try to come up with ways to pay if they are requiring that. But in New Mexico, the HIV patients as well as tuberculosis patients, as far as I know, still have no expense to try to recover from their illness or to be safe while they are terminal from their illness.
Okay. And someone, Mary Reagans, mentioned that tuberculosis still exists in the world. What is the current approach to caring for patients?
The current approach depends on what that country's government is willing to invest in it. You might like a really interesting book, Miss Riggins, that's written by a guy named Tracy Kidder, and it's about a doctor named Paul Farmer who got very interested in TB when he was in medical school. And this book is from the 90s, I think. And he heard of a TB outbreak in Peru. He went immediately to Peru, went straight to the village where it was occurring, tried to encourage people there to implement a program that would test all of the village where the person's index case was, because it was fairly resistant to the antibiotics that are known, and then treat the people for free and educate them. And the Peruvian government agreed that that was a good idea. So in this small village, the person who had it got treatment. All of his family and acquaintances in the village who tested positive got treated. All of the treatment was free, but it's very difficult to get people anywhere, no matter how educated or advanced is their society, to take a pill or 2 or 3 every single day for a year. So he trained people there and got the government to train and pay people, might be a local shopkeeper or a mom at home who needed a little extra income, to go to the homes of the people who needed to take the pill and watch them put it on their tongue and swallow it every day for a year. And that entire outbreak was controlled. In countries where they don't have anything like that, can't afford it, or don't believe in it, then people are continuing to die of TB pretty much the way they did 100 years ago. Something else I wanted to say about that. Oh, I was so fortunate this year I got to go to India for the first and last time about 3 or 4 weeks before COVID-19 really took over. And I asked the doctor there in the little area I was visiting, because I helped support an orphanage there in a place called the Nizamuddin. I asked Dr. Lippy, what's your biggest problem in the Nizamuddin? And she said tuberculosis, which was astounding to me, because India has a pretty intact nationalized healthcare. And she said, well, the people here do not really believe in Western medicine. They don't want to come to a regular doctor. They want to try an herb. They want to try who they trust as their healer. She said, and I tried hiring people to go out and give the people who tested positive their medication every single day. And it just didn't work. They wouldn't be home. They wouldn't take it. They certainly wouldn't show up at the clinic to take it. So the Indian government came up with a very interesting approach. They said, how about if we pay them a salary? You come for this whole year and take your pill every day the way you're supposed to, you get paid money. And it's working great guns. I don't know how they distribute it, if they pay a monthly or if you have to go the whole year with X number of compliance visits. Now they come to the clinic, they take their pill, and they get at the clinic free milk and eggs and meat and bread, because they need also the bigger caloric intake. So India had a novel approach. They said, oh, won't take care of yourself? Here, we'll pay you to do it. And that's how they're trying to maintain their public health, at least in that small place. And I suspect that it's available all over India and similar areas. So I forgot the original question, but I hope that covered it.
Does anyone else have any questions out there? Or would anyone like to speak? Let me know. I will unmute you and let you talk. Anybody? All right, well, then I suppose that will be it for now. Everybody, before you log off, I just want to thank you for coming. Dr. Sparks did an amazing talk and we learned so much today. So let's clap. Yay! Bravo, Twana!
Hey, Erin showed a picture of my book, and people can get it from, of course, the museum. You can also get it on Kindle or from Amazon Books. And it's just more of the same, just talking about TB and how many lives it impacted and how people's personal reaction to it.
Share. There we go. There we go. This is a picture of Twana's book, and I just want to remind everybody that you can buy this by emailing store@silvercitymuseum.org. I'm going to put the link up here for you right now. And also, please donate if possible. We will be putting up the link for donation, and there it is right there that Joe put up. Joe is our amazing communications and marketing as well as volunteer coordinator and director. So she's signed on to help me today and has done a wonderful job. You can get in touch with her at volunteer-coordinator@silvercitymuseum.org or myself at education@silvercitymuseum.org. Please, we will be putting up a survey, a link to a survey. Please fill out that survey. On it, you can also join up for the email list where you will receive information on upcoming programs, and you will be notified when this talk, which we have been recording, will show up as a link, and you'll be able to view the recorded version of this, as well as some of the other materials that Dr. Sparks has been so kind to let us put up as well. Want a longer look at some of these amazing pictures, or even a few, and some other of her source material that will be available for everybody to look at, and just so exciting. Still, if we have any more questions, anybody wants to go live and let me know and I will unmute you. In fact, I might just unmute everybody right now. And if anyone wants to say anything, unmute all. They're all free.
Laughing, Tammy.
Thank you, Twana.
I sincerely want to thank everybody who took an hour to do this. It's a big flattery to me, and one of my favorite subjects to talk about. And shout out to my granddaughter, Zaya, who's stuck in Albuquerque because she can't go back to Boston University. And Dr. Arizaga's on here. I see the guy who taught me how to do.
Whoops. Oh, shit.
Which
Start.
thank you.
Thank you. Be safe. Don't touch your face. Yeah. Hopefully by the 15th of May, we can start going out and getting back to better than normal life.
Okay, you're all getting muted again due to feedback. One more clap for Dr. Sparks. And don't forget to join us again for our next talk. I'll be putting up some information. If you're on the email list, you will be receiving that, as well as information on all of our upcoming events. We have a whole bunch of things rolling out. We'll have some virtual exhibitions coming up. We'll have the store online. Everything is going to be out, hopefully by the end of May. And we're just keeping on improving, so please help us and give what you can via that donation link that will take you to the society page, and also some more information on joining the Silver City Museum Society. Thank you. If anyone wants to talk to Dr. Sparks, you can probably do so via a chat and get her directly. So if you don't know how to do that, click on participants and click on her name, and you can talk directly to her, or we can continue through this box here. Thank you.